I'm Dr. Ted Wohnsiedler. Welcome to the telecourse Life in the Environment. In this first module, we'll be discussing plants and plant-type organisms. Basically, we'll be going through bacteria, fungi, the algae, and some of the higher plants such as mosses and ferns, and the cone-bearing plants and the flowering plants. We'll be talking about different types and varieties, and we'll be discussing to some extent anatomy and physiology, especially of the higher plants. All of life can be divided into basically 5 kingdoms. We'll be discussing 4 of those 5 kingdoms during the course of this first module. The first kingdom, Kingdom Monera, includes the bacteria. The second kingdom is Kingdom Fungi, and that includes, of course, the fungi, that is, mushroom-type organisms. The third kingdom is Kingdom Protista. That includes the algae, other organisms that we'll be talking about in a subsequent module. The fourth kingdom is Kingdom Plantae, and this includes all the higher plants. The fifth kingdom is the only kingdom we won't be discussing during this module. Monera includes, as I mentioned, all the bacteria. And there are 3 basic groups within Monera: the archaebacteria, the eubacteria, and the cyano or blue-green bacteria. In this particular segment, we want to talk about the archaebacteria. Now, the archaebacteria, like the rest of the Monerans, are called or considered to be prokaryotic. What this means very simply is that, as opposed to all higher organisms, they have no membrane surrounding the nucleus. Now, these prokaryotic bacteria range from very, very primitive forms to some advanced photosynthetic forms that we'll talk about in subsequent segments. Let's talk about the archaebacteria specifically. These represent probably the most ancient life forms on Earth. We're quite sure that the archaebacteria that live today are very similar to ancestors that existed 3.5 billion years ago. Imagine that, 3.5 billion years, probably the first life forms on this planet. Most of them are anaerobic, that is, they do not need oxygen to survive. And they're found in a variety of habitats, including saltwater habitats such as marshes and swamps, very similar to some of the habitat around us today. They're also found in sewage and in human intestines. And certain types of archaebacteria are found in sulfur springs, especially hot sulfur springs. As far as their modes of nutrition are concerned, the majority of them are heterotrophic. That is, they can't make their own food. They rely on food sources outside the body, very much as we do. Most of those that are heterotrophic are saprophytic. Saprophytic meaning that they absorb food material through the cell membrane into the body. Commonly they're referred to as saprobes. But there are different types that are autotrophic. That means that they do have the ability to synthesize their own food. There are some that are called methanogens that have the ability to produce methane, which becomes their carbon source, from carbon dioxide and hydrogen. There are also some photosynthetic forms that are photoautotrophic. But they don't use the chlorophyll found in higher plants as their photosynthetic pigment. They use a pigment called bacteria rhodopsin, very similar to a pigment that's found in the human eye, that is a visual pigment, spanning that 3.5 billion years. The next group we want to talk about are the eubacteria. These are very small organisms, best seen through the microscope. So let's go to the laboratory for that discussion. Whereas the archaebacteria that we discussed last time represent very ancient primitive bacteria, the bacteria we want to discuss today, that is the eubacteria, include the modern day forms of bacteria. Now, we're going to be talking about a few major groups of eubacteria, But understand that we can't begin to do justice to this group. The eubacteria are a very huge, very diverse, very successful group of bacteria. The eubacteria are prokaryotic. Basically what this means is that the cell is more primitive than the eukaryotes that we'll talk about later. Prokaryotic, the term, means in essence before a nucleus. In this particular case, what it practically means is that the nuclear material is not surrounded by a membrane. The DNA is present not in chromosomes, but in a circular strand called a genophore. There are other characteristics that are used to describe prokaryotic cells, but it's not really necessary to go into them in detail. Most of the eubacteria belong to three major groups: the Coccibacteria, the Spirillibacteria, and the Bacillibacteria. I think probably the best way to study them is to take a look at them through the microscope. Let's start first with the Coccibacteria. The Coccibacteria are round-shaped bacteria, and they include a number of types that are pathogenic. For example, a type of oral coccus, the Streptococcus, can cause strep throat. Another type of coccus bacteria, that is Staphylococcus, is responsible for infections and for boils. The second type of bacteria that we want to take a look at are the Bacillibacteria. Now, rather than being round or spherical shaped like the Coccibacteria, they're rod-shaped. One of the most important of the bacilli is Escherichia coli. E. coli is a commensal that lives in the intestinal tract of warm-blooded organisms. Because of that, it's present in, for example, human sewage, and the level of E. coli found in human sewage can indicate whether water is polluted by sewage or not, what they refer to as coliform counts. Coliform counts in certain rivers can be extremely high due to heavy dumping of human sewage. Third group of bacteria that we want to look at are the Spirillibacteria. Now, for the most part, the Spirilli are the largest of the bacteria. Most of them are motile, using either cilia or flagella, and they're important in ponds and lakes as a food source for protozoans and other types of organisms. We do want to discuss a few other types of bacteria. Those bacteria include rickettsia. One type of rickettsial bacteria is a pathogen that causes Rocky Mountain spotted fever. We've had a few cases of that in New York State every year for the last few years. Another group are the spirochetes. These are basically S-shaped or spiral-shaped bacteria. One type causes syphilis. Another pathogen is responsible for Lyme disease, some disease that's very topical in the Northeast in the last few years. There's been a lot of cases of Lyme disease. A third group of bacteria are the chlamydia. The chlamydia are bacteria that cause urogenital infections and types of venereal diseases. One pathogenic chlamydia is responsible for the leading cause of blindness worldwide, and that's trachoma. We're standing in my garden in the Finger Lakes to discuss modes of nutrition in the eubacteria. Now, most of the eubacteria are heterotrophic. That is, they rely on a food source outside the organism's body. They can't make their own food. Most of them are saprophytic. That is, they are feeding on dead and decaying material, decomposing it. We'll talk more about decomposition in a moment, and absorbing this food material through the cell wall and membrane. That's how they get their nutrition. There are a few types that are autotrophic, but we'll deal more with the autotrophs when we talk about the third group, the cyanobacteria. Most of the eubacteria are also aerobic. The organisms in this compost bed that are going to be breaking down this organic matter use oxygen. It's a much more efficient process for respiration and the production of energy. There are a few types that are anaerobic, but those that are anaerobic use a process called fermentation. And you might be more familiar with it with the fermenting of wine. Those are anaerobic bacteria. The energy yield is much less. As I mentioned, Bacteria, along with the fungi, are major decomposers in the environment. It is the role of these bacteria and fungi to take all of the organic material from dead plants and dead animals and break it down into its basic nutrients, the nitrates, phosphates, carbon, calcium, and other nutrients that are so important to life. Without these decomposers, eventually, with no decomposition occurring, all life on Earth would cease. Bacteria, at least some of them, have another important role in the ecosystem as well. There are certain types of bacteria that are said to be nitrogen fixing. And as a matter of fact, as we look at these bean plants on either side of me, these are two types of garden plants that are nitrogen fixing. Now, although we say the beans or the peas are nitrogen fixing, it's actually a type of bacteria called rhizobium that live on the roots of these bean plants. Now, these rhizobium bacteria live in little nodules like little homes or houses on the roots. And it is the rhizobium that take atmospheric nitrogen, of which there is a surplus, 70+% of the atmosphere is nitrogen, and convert it to the nitrate ion. Now, as nitrate, the plants can use it readily as a source of fertilizer. Nitrate's one of the most important fertilizers for plants. So in essence, these rhizobium bacteria are providing nutrition for these types of plants called legumes. It's not only beans, but as I mentioned, peas, clover, alfalfa. These plants then in turn enrich the soil. Now, the next thing we want to discuss is that third group in Monera, the cyanobacteria, and to discuss those, let's go to a pond, which is their normal habitat. Last group we want to talk about in Kingdom Monera, this is the third group of bacteria, are the cyanobacteria. Now, these organisms were formerly known as the blue-green algae because all of them are photosynthetic and therefore very algae-like. However, since they are prokaryotic, they're now classified in Kingdom Monera. These are organisms that are found very commonly in lakes and ponds, in aquatic habitats, and in moist soil and dead logs in terrestrial habitats. The dominant pigment is chlorophyll A. It's the same chlorophyll that's found in higher plants, and of course it is the photosynthetic pigment. But there are other pigments present. A blue pigment and a red pigment often override the green and gives the cyanobacteria some variations in color. As a matter of fact, the Red Sea that's mentioned so frequently in the Bible, in the Old Testament, gets its name because there are huge populations of red cyanobacteria that are present most of the time. As far as their ecological importance is concerned, like some of the eubacteria we talked about, there are cyanobacteria that are nitrogen fixing. For example, the genus Anabina is one of the better known of the nitrogen-fixing cyanobacteria. Like the bacteria, therefore, they can enrich habitats, that is, by adding nitrate or fertilizer to those habitats. The Orientals, for example, for thousands of years have been culturing nitrogen-fixing cyanobacteria in their rice paddies to increase the production of rice. Also, many of the cyanobacteria form specialized cells called heterocysts. Now, a heterocyst is nothing more than a resistant cell, and this is not uncommon in lower plants and animals where some kind of resistant stage occurs within the life cycle. These resistant cells then can withstand adverse environmental conditions. For example, if the pond or the rotting log that these blue-greens are living in dry up, become desiccated, the population of cyanobacteria will die except for the heterocysts. They'll remain dormant, and when moisture or water returns to the habitat, they'll germinate, they'll develop into a new cyanobacteria population. The cyanobacteria as a group are very tolerant species. They can withstand very high salinity and temperature and very low pH, that is, acidified habitats. Because of this, you'll find them very often in huge population numbers in areas where other organisms don't exist. For example, in polluted lakes, they'll undergo huge blooms. Or, for example, like this pond behind me that's enriched from all the field fertilizer runoff and is choked out with vegetation. There'll be huge populations of cyanobacteria here as well. When these populations die and decompose, that removes oxygen from the water, and it can cause huge fish kills and kills of other types of organisms as well. Some of them produce toxins directly. For example, the genus Microcystis, when it dies and decomposes, releases toxin that can directly kill fish or any animals that drink the water if the toxin's present in high enough concentration. This concludes our discussion of kingdom Monera. Next, we want to talk about members of kingdom fungi, and let's go to a forest habitat for that discussion.